Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. Waverly Hills Asylum, the dark shadow of Kentucky. Waverly Hills, once a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, located in the heart of Kentucky, has long been a place that leaves no one indifferent, even to those who have merely heard of it. Today, this terrifying complex, once a beacon of hope for thousands, has become one of the most well-known locations for ghost hunters seeking answers about the souls that linger after horrific experiments and death. Its history is one of horror, longing, and an endless struggle for life that yielded no victory. Each floor, each corridor of this place holds shadows of the past, like ominous echoes of groans and cries. Founded in 1910, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium was designed to treat tuberculosis patients, an epidemic that struck the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The place seemed like a dream for those hoping to regain their health, as it was located among the picturesque hills of Kentucky, far from the city's smog, with clean air and a peaceful atmosphere. But after a few years, it became clear that this institution was merely a facade for darker and more terrifying things happening behind its walls. If you had walked through Waverly Hills during its peak, you would have seen hundreds of beds filled with people who were doomed to face a terrible end. Doctors did not know how to effectively treat tuberculosis, so they applied the latest, often brutal methods. They performed primitive surgical procedures, sometimes amputating diseased parts of the body, hoping for recovery. But the worst came later when experiments were conducted not to save lives, but merely to further scientific progress. However, another danger loomed over Waverly Hills. Patients who could no longer be saved by traditional methods became victims of radical experiments that went beyond humanity. Doctors conducted unethical research, attempting to find cures by using new methods such as injections of unknown substances and studying the body's reactions to these chemicals. Many people died from these unjustifiable scientific methods, but the doctors continued, believing they could save future patients. In 1928, a new building was opened to treat more severe forms of tuberculosis, but this marked the beginning of horrific events. New patients were admitted to this filthy, cold facility where sanitary conditions were catastrophic. Doctors continued their experiments, even openly defying the public. The community began to suspect that something was wrong with this place. Patients often disappeared without a trace, and new people coming to the sanatorium would find only empty, gloomy rooms, where the only sound was the echo of their footsteps. One day, a disaster occurred that changed the course of Waverly Hills history. A fire engulfed part of the sanatorium, claiming the lives of dozens of people who tried to escape the death that surrounded them. The doctors denied any responsibility for the fire, but this was the moment when everyone began to speak of the sinister place where even death could not find peace. Local residents began noticing strange things happening around the complex: whispers at night, unfriendly glances from the windows of empty buildings, and mysterious silhouettes appearing against the backdrop of the setting sun. By the end of the 1960s, Waverly Hills ceased to exist as a sanatorium and was closed down. But it was then that rumors started to spread about how the place had become home to something far more sinister. Immediately after its closure, visitors began telling stories about how they saw the ghosts of patients still walking the hallways, groaning in pain and torment. They spoke of silhouettes of doctors conducting their experiments, even after they themselves had long since departed this world. And anyone who dared to come close felt as if they were touching the dark, hidden sides of the human soul. Today, more than a century after its opening, Waverly Hills remains one of the most terrifying places in the United States. Ghost hunters visit it annually, hoping to encounter those who remain, watching them from the shadows. And even if you don't believe in ghosts, when you find yourself there in the middle of the night and the dark corridors begin to come alive, you'll feel something that words cannot explain. It's more than just a place, it's an echo of the past that will never leave Waverly Hills. It's a story of horrors that cannot be forgotten. Waverly Hills, like many other institutions that became dark symbols of their era, left behind secrets that still haunt to this day. A place that once treated the deadliest disease of its time, it became a symbol of cruelty, later bringing so much sorrow and suffering. After the sanatorium closed in 1961, Waverly Hills remained abandoned, but only at first glance. Nature began to reclaim the land, wrapping the ruins in trees and vines, but even this couldn't conceal the ominous aura that enveloped the place. For decades, Waverly Hills became increasingly popular among horror seekers. Rumors of restless spirits floated in the air, and with each passing year, the place became more dangerous for those who dared to spend the night. One such group consisted of ghost hunters who traveled from all corners of America, hoping to capture unexplained phenomena and gather material for their documentaries. On one autumn evening in 1995, a group of young people, led by amateur journalist Jack Thompson, decided to spend the night at Waverly Hills. Jack had long heard legends about the place and was convinced that he could not only capture ghosts on film but also uncover all the mysteries of the location. The group arrived at the sanatorium grounds just before dark, bringing cameras, flashlights, and all the necessary equipment for the investigation. Of course, they began their journey at one of the scariest places, the helipad. This was the location where, during the sanatorium's operation, special equipment was used to transport patients with the most severe forms of tuberculosis. The helipad had long been covered in grass and moss, but its concrete remnants looked so ominous that even those with experience studying paranormal events felt uneasy. The group decided to start their expedition at night, when darkness and mist created the perfect conditions for unpredictable events. Jack was keeping a detailed record when one of the group members, Thomas, noticed something strange in the distance. The silhouettes in the windows of the upper floors seemed alive. They appeared to move from room to room, even though no one had been in the building for years. The silhouettes quickly vanished, leaving only a sense of unease. Maybe it's just reflections of light, Jack reassured his friends, but his own hand was trembling from fear. Despite this, the group didn't stop, continuing down the dusty corridor of the main building. With every step, their footsteps echoed in the silence that filled the sanatorium. However, the further they went, the more the tension grew. Suddenly, the camera of Jack's group started malfunctioning. At first, it seemed like a simple technical failure, but when the camera only captured black screens, and objects in the footage began distorting before the camera completely shut off, the group felt a cold sweat on their foreheads. Was this the first sign that they had ventured too far? Everyone began checking their devices when they suddenly heard heavy breathing. But the more they listened, the more it seemed that the breathing wasn't coming from any of them, it was coming from the building itself, as if the structure was breathing along with them. The group looked at their flashlights, and for a moment, it seemed like the darkness in the corridor wasn't just sliced by their light, but by something else, something invisible. "We need to leave," whispered Lisa, one of the group members, feeling her heart race. But Jack disagreed. He decided to continue, trying to gather more proof that this place had a life of its own, a mystical force. The group made their way through fallen walls and old furniture left from when the sanatorium was still operational. The aged paintings on the walls looked strangely faded, but suddenly one of them shifted, revealing a mysterious room that wasn't on the building's plans. It was a small chamber, with only one old lamp that barely illuminated the space. The air inside was thick, as though it hadn't been breathed in for years. It was hard to breathe, but the group still decided to enter. As soon as they crossed the threshold of the room, the door slammed shut behind them. The flashlights went out. The room plunged into complete darkness. And then they heard it, a whisper. At first, it was barely audible, but with every passing second, it grew clearer. It was a whisper of words they couldn't understand, but as it grew louder, it felt as though someone was standing right next to them. The whisper turned into voices. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. He rushed to the door, trying to break it down. But nothing worked. And then, at the very last moment, when the group was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, the door opened on its own. They all rushed out into the corridor, gasping for air. Behind them, from the darkness, footsteps echoed. The sound of the steps forced them to look back with every step they took. But they could not stop. When they reached the exit, they realized they had entered the very epicenter of the terror of this place. They understood one thing: Waverly Hills was not just a place. It was a living entity. And now it knew them. They had become part of it, just like those who had lived there long ago when they were still suffering from tuberculosis. Waverly Hills had always been with them, and it would never let them go. When Jack's group returned to the main building, they tried to breathe calmly, but the heavy pressure that hung in the air didn't lessen. They all felt as though they were no longer in the real world. Each step they took through the crumbling corridor echoed like the endless silence that seemed thick, saturated with something invisible. However, what frightened them even more was that despite all the horrifying things they had already endured, every time they tried to leave, it felt as though the place wouldn't let them go. The only source of light near them was Jack's flashlight, still trembling in his hand. Somewhere in the darkness, amidst the old medical equipment and empty rooms, they heard a distant sound, like metal scraping against concrete, likely something heavy moving across the floor. Each of them felt cold sweat form on their foreheads. "This isn't just the wind," whispered Lisa, but even she didn't believe her own words. Suddenly, Jack's flashlight flickered brighter for a moment, and they saw it. A huge shadow appeared on the wall, but it didn't have the outline of a person or an animal. It was just a formless, dark mass that seemed to swallow the light around it. The mass moved swiftly, as if the laws of physics meant nothing. It began to approach them, consuming the space around them. The footsteps in the corridor receded, but it seemed like the shadow itself had begun hunting them. "Run!" shouted Jack, and they all bolted forward, not looking back. But every movement felt lost in the vast labyrinth of this merciless place. They stumbled into an old elevator that had been abandoned since the 1930s. It seemed as if the elevator itself had a will of its own. Jack pressed the button, but nothing happened. Panic spread among them. Thomas, who had been walking calmly with the group, suddenly froze in fear. He stood, staring into the darkness, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something that had the most terrifying effect on him. "Thomas! Thomas!" Jack shouted, but Thomas didn't respond. Everyone began pulling him, trying to flee, but Thomas remained rooted to the spot. Then Jack realized, he wasn't just scared, he had seen something. And that something was coming closer. The vision began to become clearer. The shadows on the walls started to shift. And then, at the very end of the corridor, they saw it. A person, or what had once been a person, but had long since lost its human essence. It was a figure wrapped in a white coat, torn into pieces. Its face was mutilated, looking as though it was not one body, but a blend of living and dead parts. Black liquid flowed from its eyes, and an endless groan came from its mouth. They don't leave here," Lisa said, her voice trembling, and her chest heavy with fear. She understood that this embodied nightmare had no intention of letting them go. And then the ghost began moving toward them, its feet sliding across the floor, as though it didn't step on the ground, but hovered between the world of the living and the dead. Each step pierced them with cold fear. This is only the beginning, Jack thought, feeling the relentless, formless gaze passing through him. Whether it was a vision or reality, he couldn't tell anymore. Thomas began whispering, as if hearing the words of the terrifying ghost. His hand reached for the wall, and with each movement he made, sounds began to echo, the shadows twisted, and from every corner of the sanatorium came cracks and whispers. At that moment, Jack felt his legs begin to move on their own. He tried to fight the force, but he felt his body slowly rising, as if the sky itself was taking him away. And suddenly, at the moment when it seemed he would disappear into the darkness, he heard Thomas's voice. "They're taking us, all of us," Thomas said, his voice empty, as though soulless. Jack realized that it wasn't just one ghost, but an entire army of suffering souls who had died here and now could not find peace. The sight of the walls of the sanatorium revealed countless new, terrifying images. The walls seemed alive, the scars on them reminding them of countless torments. In every corner, in every bend of the corridors, Jack saw movements, formless shadows racing with terrifying speed, ones that couldn't be avoided. He felt his soul beginning to weaken. The group realized their time on this earth was coming to an end. Waverly Hills had no intention of letting them go. And even when they tried to escape, the place pulled them back. In the merciless darkness, their strength melted away, and all that remained were the moans and forgotten names. But what struck them most was that their footprints were no longer there. When the police arrived days later to investigate the group's disappearance, they found no bodies, no trace of them at all. Only emptiness, where people had once existed. Waverly Hills became lonely again, but only until the next group decided to come, and the cycle would repeat once more. This place had become a soulless pit that could not be left alive. Waverly Hills, with its dark corridors and relentless ghosts, became a legend that no one could ever forget. Since the group of Jack disappeared into the terrifying labyrinth of Waverly Hills, new, even more eerie rumors began to spread about the sanatorium. Locals started telling stories of strange flashes of light at night, appearing from windows that couldn't be opened from the inside, of voices echoing in the quiet nights, and of strange shapes moving inside the crumbling walls. Many began to avoid the area, and those who dared to get closer disappeared without a trace. Several years after Jack and his group went missing, the one who had once been skeptical of the rumors returned to Waverly Hills. Edward Sharp, an old journalist who had worked for decades at the local newspaper, had heard many times of the mystical events that occurred at the sanatorium. He decided to investigate all these legends. Gathering material for an article, he arrived at the site, ready to reveal the world the mysticism that haunted the ruins of the old sanatorium. But what he discovered there surpassed all his ideas of evil. Edward arrived at Waverly Hills on a late autumn night, when the air was soaked with moisture and a cold sensation that something was wrong. The fog lay on the ground, filling every corner of the dark area. The old journalist walked along the broken path, looking at the collapsed walls and doors that were left without locks. The sanatorium seemed to have long forgotten human footsteps, but in its shadow, there still flickered gazes that didn't want anyone to immerse themselves in their world. Each of his steps sounded as if he were stepping on the bones of those who had once been here. All the sounds were too loud, echoing, and every movement of shadows on the walls seemed alive. After walking through several corridors, Edward heard something quietly following him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but when his body suddenly became heavy, and his heart began to beat twice as fast, he realized he was being pursued. Someone was behind him. And it wasn't alive, because with every step, more and more ghosts appeared around him, white, translucent figures that followed him, emitting cold. Edward began running wildly through the dark corridors. He turned around every corner, but always encountered more and more ghosts that emerged from the shadows. They all wore old-fashioned clothes, their faces were disfigured and helpless, but tears flowed from their eyes, freezing on the spot. The breaking of metal doors, whispers from the darkness, dull knocks, and soul-crushing screams accompanied every step he took. Remembering the stories he had heard before, Edward understood, this wasn't just mysticism, it was a picture of endless suffering that had remained in these walls. The people who had died here during the experiments, who had suffered the torment of illness and hopelessness, could not leave this place. Their souls remained here to torment anyone who dared to open these gates again. Edward tried to find an exit, but every path seemed enchanted. He kept returning to the same place over and over again. And just when it seemed that he couldn't endure anymore, his eyes once again fell on an old door leading to a storage room. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that this place had once been the same hospital where the horrific experiments had taken place. Remnants of medical instruments, old journals filled with painful records, scars on the walls, reminders of all the souls who couldn't leave this world. The ghosts around him grew closer. Among them, he saw them, the dead patients, long no longer human, but still repeating the horrific experiments. The spirits stared at him from the darkness as if he were a new victim. And then Edward heard it, their voices, the whisper that echoed from the walls, telling him one thing: you won't get out of here. The exit he sought was just an illusion. Waverly Hills did not leave and did not let go. It was a living part of the suffering, part of the body and soul of those who died here without finding peace. Everyone who crossed its threshold became part of this place. They remained within it. Edward could no longer leave this place. His voice merged with the others, whispering in the darkness, his body became part of this merciless nightmare. And only several months later, when the next group of horror seekers arrived at Waverly Hills, they found yet another chamber, where there was an old note. It looked as if it had been written by Edward himself: you won't return. You'll become part of this place. And since then, Waverly Hills remained as it was. Never letting go. Relentlessly consuming anyone who dared to find its dark and abandoned walls again. Waverly Hills is no longer just a sanatorium. It is a cursed place, where every step in the darkness leads to endless torment. And there is no exit. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.